They did not call it a death sentence. They called it a diplomatic assignment, special envoy designation, Class 7, which in the Conclave's formal classification system meant an assignment of exceptional sensitivity requiring exceptional capability, which sounded like the highest honor the diplomatic corps could bestow, and which was, in practice, the designation used when the Conclave needed someone to go somewhere that no one expected them to come back from, and needed the sending to look like something other than what it was. Ambassador Ryo Osai had been in the diplomatic corps for 19 years. He had been in enough rooms where things were called by the wrong names to know the right name when he heard it. He knew what Class 7 meant. He accepted anyway. Not because he was naive. Not because the honor of it overcame the reality of it. Because the mission was real, and the thing it was trying to reach was real, and 19 years in the diplomatic corps had produced in him a specific and comprehensive understanding of which things mattered enough to accept the wrong name for. The thing the mission was trying to reach was called the HFY silence. The silence was not a weapon in any conventional sense, not a vessel, not a technology, not a physical object that could be located and retrieved and brought back. It was a concept, a principle. Something that the HFY, who had been one of the most significant civilizations in the galaxy's history, before they became one of the most significant civilizations in the galaxy's past, had developed across 400 years of existence, and encoded in a body of knowledge that their last surviving members had hidden before the end, in a location that the Conclave's Archive Division had been trying to find for 200 years. What made the silence significant was what it could do. Not as a weapon, as its opposite. The silence was a principle of de-escalation so complete that the Conclave's theoretical division had spent 200 years arguing about whether it could actually work, whether any principle could interrupt the momentum of conflict at the scale the historical record suggested it had interrupted. Whether the 3 occasions in HFY history where the silence had been applied and had ended conflicts that the military projections had said would continue for decades were genuine applications of the principle or historical coincidence dressed up as causality. The argument had been running for 200 years. The argument was why the Conclave's Security Council had spent the last 6 weeks watching a conflict in the Valith corridor escalate through 7 stages of the Council's escalation framework, without finding a mechanism to interrupt it, because the mechanisms they had produced frameworks for had all been tried and none had worked. And the conflict was now at a point where the projections said it continued for another 40 years and kills another 900 million people. And the only thing the projections' uncertainty range agreed on was that the current trajectory was catastrophic. The HFY silence, if it existed, and if it worked the way the historical record suggested, could interrupt the trajectory. The location where the HFY's last members had hidden it was a system called Vethar 7, which was outside Conclave space, in a region that the cartographic database described as contested, and that the Valith corridor conflict had made actively dangerous, and that the Intelligence Division's assessment described as accessible only through the conflict zone, at sufficient risk, to justify the Class 7 designation. Class 7, which meant exceptional sensitivity requiring exceptional capability, which meant the Conclave was sending one person because one person was smaller than a fleet and harder to target, and if they did not come back, the Conclave had not officially sent anyone. Senior Arbiter Nallon had not been in the room when the Class 7 designation was assigned. She had been briefed afterward and had looked at the briefing document for a long time before she called Ambassador Reyes. She said, "They are sending Osai." Reyes said, "I know." She said, "He knows what Class 7 means." Reyes said, "I know." She said, "Is Earth aware of this assignment?" Reyes was quiet for a moment. She said, "Earth is aware." She said, "And?" Reyes said, "Osa accepted. Earth's position is that Osai is a serving diplomat with full authority over his own assignment decisions. He accepted. Earth respects that. Nalon said, "The assignment is a death sentence dressed as a diplomatic designation." Reyes was quiet again. She said, "I know. Osai knows." He accepted anyway. Nalon looked at the briefing document. She said, "Why?" Reyes said, "Because the mission is real and the thing it is trying to reach is real, and Ryo Os has 19 years of diplomatic service and the specific quality of someone who knows which things are worth the wrong name." Nalon set the briefing document down. She said, "If he does not come back." Reyes said, "He will come back." She said, "You do not know that." Reyes said, "I know Ryo Osai." She said the second thing and the first thing simultaneously, and Nalon heard both and understood both, and did not argue with either because argument was not the right response to something that was both true and not enough. Osai left on a Thursday. He left in a vessel that was not a diplomatic transport. The Conclave's logistics division had assigned him a diplomatic transport because Class 7 assignments received standard-issue vessels, and standard-issue vessels for diplomatic assignments were transports. Osai had looked at the transport and looked at the route through the conflict zone, and had signed the standard-issue transport back to logistics, and had arranged his own vessel, which was a thing that Class 7 designation technically permitted because exceptional sensitivity requiring exceptional capability left the capability question to the assignee. The vessel he arranged was not large. It was not armed in any way that the Conclave's weapons registry would have catalogued as significant. It was, on every sensor profile that the conflict zone's monitoring systems would produce when they looked at it, the least interesting thing moving through that region of space. The second least interesting thing. The first was what Osai had put inside it. He had spent 6 weeks, from the date of the briefing to the date of departure, doing what he did when he was preparing for the hardest version of a problem, which was reading everything that existed about the problem. Not the summary, everything. The Conclave's full archive on the Rith-Kai civilization, 400 years of documentation, the theoretical division's 200 years of arguments about the silence, the intelligence division's 200 years of failed attempts to locate Vethar 7, the historical record of the 3 occasions the silence had been applied. He had read it in the order that made the most sense to him, which was not chronological but architectural, starting with what the silence was supposed to do and working backward to what it was, and how it had been built, and where it had been kept, and why the Rith-Kai's last members had chosen Vethar 7 as the location. The why was the part that the intelligence division's 200 years of searching had not fully incorporated. The Rith-Kai's last members had chosen the location because of what the location was, not because it was remote, not because it was hidden, because of what Vethar 7 specifically contained that made it the correct place to put something that was a principle rather than an object. The intelligence division's searches had been looking for a physical cache, a room, a vault, a storage medium containing encoded data. They had been looking for the silence as though it were a document. Osai had read for 6 weeks and had arrived at a different understanding. The silence was not a document. It was a demonstration. What the Rith-Kai's last members had hidden was not the principle. The principle could not be hidden. It had been applied 3 times and the applications were in the historical record for anyone to study. What they had hidden was the evidence, the specific, documented, verified evidence of how it worked, the record of the mechanism, not the theory, which the theoretical division had been arguing about for 200 years, but the proof. The proof was in Vethar 7, the system that was in the middle of the conflict zone, the system that the intelligence division had been unable to reach for 200 years, because reaching it required passing through contested space that had been contested for various reasons across 200 years, and was currently contested at the most dangerous level of the Conclave's conflict classification. Osai looked at the conflict zone on his navigation display for a long time before he entered it. He thought about 900 million people on the current trajectory. He thought about what the proof, if he found it, could do. He entered the conflict zone. The Valeth Corridor conflict had been running for 7 years. 7 years had produced the specific geography of a sustained conflict, the established patrol patterns and the territorial boundaries, and the zones of active engagement, and the zones of active avoidance, and the complex spatial logic of two parties that had been fighting in a region long enough to know every part of it at a granular level. Osai had read the Intelligence Division's full assessment of the conflict zone's spatial logic. He moved through it the way that reading about something and understanding it deeply produced movement through it, finding the paths that the spatial logic created between the zones of active engagement, the seams in the geography that were not contested because neither party used them, because neither party needed them for anything except passing through. He needed them for passing through. He passed through, not without incident. On the 4th day inside the conflict zone, a patrol vessel from one of the parties detected his vessel and hailed it. He responded on the diplomatic frequency, identified himself by name and designation, stated his destination as Vethar 7, and waited. The patrol vessel ran his identification for 11 minutes. Then it said, Vethar 7 is in the deep contested zone. No vessel has reached it in 7 years. He said, I am aware. I'm attempting to reach it. The patrol vessel said, why? He said, I am looking for something that ended a war, several wars, 200 years ago. I believe it is in that system, and I believe if I find it I can end this one. The patrol vessel was quiet for a long time. Then it said, we will not prevent your passage, we will not assist it. He said, I understand, thank you. He continued. On the 7th day, he reached Vethar 7. The system was what the cartographic database described it as, and what the database description did not fully capture, which was the quality of a place that had been significant and was now empty of everything except the significance. 3 planetary bodies orbiting a dim star, no active settlements, no operational infrastructure, nothing that the sensors could find that was current. Everything in the system was old. Osai spent 6 hours scanning the system. The Intelligence Division's searches had looked for physical storage, had scanned for materials consistent with data vaults, preservation containers, the technologies that civilizations used to store information for long-term retrieval. Osai looked for something different. He looked for the thing that the Rithkai's last members had chosen this system for, the thing that made Vethar 7 the correct place to hide a demonstration. He found it on the 2nd planet. Not a vault, not a container, not a stored document or a preserved data system. A structure. A small structure, built from the 2nd planet's native materials, designed not for permanence in the way that storage facilities were designed, but for understanding, designed to be read rather than opened. The way a document was different from a container in that a document communicated through what it was rather than through what it held. The structure was the demonstration. What the Rithkai's last members had hidden was not the principle of the silence encoded in a medium. They had built the evidence of the principle into the structure of a building that encoded, in its architecture and its spatial relationships and the specific arrangement of its components, the mechanism by which the silence worked. Not as a theory, as a proof, as a demonstration that could be walked through and understood directly rather than argued about in theoretical terms. Osai walked through it. He spent 4 days in the structure. He walked through it multiple times. He documented everything. He cross-referenced what the structure showed him against what the historical record had described about the 3 applications. He followed the logic of the demonstration from its first element to its last, and he understood, at the end of the fourth day, what the theoretical division had been arguing about for 200 years, and what the argument had been missing. The argument had been missing the mechanism. The silence did not work by addressing the reasons parties fought. It worked by addressing the thing underneath the reasons. The thing that was the same in every conflict regardless of what the conflict was about. The thing that the reasons were built on top of, and that sustained the reasons even when the reasons had been addressed, and the conflict continued anyway. The thing underneath was the calculation. Not the strategic calculation, the cellular calculation, the one that parties to a conflict made at a level below strategy, the calculation that said continuing was safer than stopping, that the moment of cessation was the moment of maximum vulnerability, that the only safe position was the position of sustained engagement, because sustained engagement at least had a known cost, and stopping had an unknown one. The silence worked by making the calculation untrue. Not by argument, by demonstration, by producing in the space between the parties a condition in which the calculation of continuing cost more than the calculation of stopping, not abstractly, not in the long-term strategic sense that frameworks and negotiations tried to produce, but immediately, concretely, in the specific moment when the decision was being made. The mechanism was the proof. The structure was the mechanism encoded. The structure showed how. Osai documented everything. He left Vethar 7 on the 5th day. He moved back through the conflict zone the way he had moved through it coming in, finding the seams, using the spatial logic the 7 years had produced. On the 9th day out, he passed through the same region where the patrol vessel had stopped him. The patrol vessel was there again, on a different rotation but there. It hailed him. He responded. The patrol vessel said, "You reached it." He said, "Yes." The patrol vessel said, "Did you find what you were looking for?" He said, "Yes." The patrol vessel was quiet for a moment. Then it said, "What was it?" He thought about how to answer that. He said, "Proof that the calculation is wrong, that stopping is safer than continuing, proof that makes that true in the moment rather than in theory." The patrol vessel said, "Does it work?" He said, 3 times in 400 years it worked. I believe it will work again. I intend to find out." The patrol vessel said, "We have been fighting for 7 years." He said, "I know." The patrol vessel said, 900 million is the projection." He said, "I know that too." The patrol vessel was quiet for a long time. Then it said, "If it works, if you use it and it works, will it hold?" He said, "The 3 times it worked, it held. Not because the proof was permanent, because the demonstration changed what both parties knew about the calculation. Once you know the calculation is wrong, you cannot unknow it. The knowing changes what you do with the next moment, and the next, and eventually the moments accumulate into something that holds." The patrol vessel said, "And if it does not work?" He said, "Then I will have been wrong about what I found and the trajectory continues, and the 900 million is the cost of my being wrong." He paused. He said, "I do not think I am wrong." The patrol vessel was quiet for the last time. Then it said, "Safe passage, Ambassador." He said, "Thank you." He cleared the conflict zone on the 14th day. He transmitted his documentation to the Conclave's Archive Division and the Security Council and the Theoretical Division simultaneously, because the Theoretical Division had been arguing for 200 years and deserved to see the proof, and because the Security Council needed to understand what it was before he used it, and because the Archive Division was the institutional memory of the galactic community and needed to hold this regardless of what came next. Then he requested an emergency session of the Security Council. Nalan convened it in 4 hours. Os walked into the chamber looking like 14 days in a conflict zone, and 4 days in a structure on the second planet of Vethar 7 looked, which was significant but not broken, which was the specific quality of someone who had been where he had been and had carried what he found and was here now to do the next thing. He sat down. He looked at the council. He said, "I found the HFY silence." The council looked at him. He said, "It is not a weapon. I want to be clear about that before I describe it. The theoretical division has been arguing about it for 200 years in the framing of a strategic capability, a tool that ends conflicts by force of principle. That framing is wrong. The silence is not a weapon. It is a demonstration, a proof. It demonstrates something that both parties in a conflict need to see at the same moment in order for the calculation they are making about the cost of stopping to change." Drethon said, "What does it demonstrate?" Osai said, "That stopping is safer than continuing, not in the abstract, not in the long term, in the moment, immediately, in a way that both parties experience as true rather than as argued at them." He paused. He said, "The mechanism is in the documentation I transmitted. The theoretical division will want to review it. I am requesting authorization to apply the demonstration to the Valeth corridor conflict before the review is complete." The council looked at him. Nalan said, "Before the review." He said, "The review will take weeks. The projection on the current trajectory is 900 million. Every week the review takes is a cost the projection does not account for as theory, but the people in the corridor account for as their lives." The council was quiet. Arai said, "You spent 4 days in the structure. You believe you understand the mechanism." He said, "I spent 4 days in a structure that 400 years of HFY knowledge built to be understood. I walked through it until it was clear. I cross-referenced it against the historical record of 3 applications. I believe I understand it sufficiently to apply it." She said, "Sufficiently." He said, "I do not claim certainty. I claim the best understanding available of a mechanism that ended 3 conflicts in 400 years, and that the trajectory of this one makes worth attempting at the risk of my being wrong." The room was quiet for a long time. Nalan looked at the council. She said, "The council will vote on authorization." The vote was 14-3 in favor. The 3 who voted against were not against Osai. They were against the specific feeling of authorizing something that had not been fully reviewed, because the 900 million was a projection, and projections had error ranges, and error ranges were where doubt lived. Osai understood. He requested one more thing before the session ended. He said, "I need both parties at a table, not a negotiation table, a demonstration. I need them in the same space at the same time for long enough to walk through the proof. That is the mechanism, not the talking, the being in the presence of it together." Nalan said, "Both parties have refused direct engagement for 7 years." He said they were refusing negotiation. "I am not offering negotiation. I am offering a demonstration of something that changes the calculation. The refusal was about cost. The demonstration addresses cost directly." She said, "You believe they will come?" He said, "I believe that if I describe what I found correctly, in the right terms to the right people, the parties will come because the alternative is continuing to pay the cost the projection describes, and I am going to describe what I found in terms that make the cost of not coming higher than the cost of coming." Nalan looked at him. She said, "You are going to use the silence to get them to the table to hear about the silence." He said, "Yes. The mechanism begins before the formal demonstration. The mechanism is the truth about the calculation, applied at every point where a decision is being made, including the decision to come." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Go." He went. He contacted both parties through the channels that the 7 years had left open, the formal communication lines that sustained conflicts maintained, because even parties that would not negotiate needed to communicate about the logistics of conflict. He spoke to the people who answered those channels, not the leaders, not the decision makers, the people who managed the lines. He told them what he had found, not in the language of diplomacy, in the language of the calculation, in the specific terms of what the structure on Vethar 7 had shown him about the cost of stopping versus the cost of continuing, in terms that were concrete and immediate rather than strategic and abstract. He said, the moment you have been most afraid of is the moment of stopping. The calculation says that moment is the moment of maximum vulnerability. I have proof that the calculation is wrong, that the moment of stopping is the safest moment available, not because I am arguing it, because the proof shows the mechanism by which it is true. I am offering both parties the opportunity to see the proof, together, in the same space, 60 minutes. After 60 minutes, you can make any decision you choose with the full information the proof provides. Both parties said no. He called again. He said, I have just returned from Vethar 7. I passed through your conflict zone to reach it. I spoke with a patrol vessel on the way in and on the way out. The patrol vessel asked me if what I found would work. I said I believed it would. The patrol vessel said safe passage. I want you to think about what it means that a vessel actively engaged in this conflict said safe passage to someone trying to end it. The people in this conflict know the calculation. They are paying it. The decision makers are protecting themselves from the calculation's cost in ways that the people paying it do not have access to. The proof I am offering is for the decision makers to see what the people paying the cost already know. Both parties said no. He called a third time. He said only one thing. He said 900 million. He waited. Both parties called him back within an hour. Both parties said yes. The demonstration took place on neutral ground, in a space that Osai had designed based on what the structure on Vethar 7 had shown him about the conditions that the mechanism required. Not large, not formal, the spatial equivalent of the structure itself, arranged to walk both parties through the proof in the order the proof required. He walked them through it. Not talking, demonstrating, showing the mechanism the way the structure had shown it to him, in the spatial and relational terms that the Rith Kai's last members had encoded into the building they had left behind. It took 4 hours. At the end of 4 hours, both parties were in a room together, having seen the same thing at the same time. They were quiet for a long time. Then the lead representative of one party said something to the lead representative of the other party that was not directed at Osai, and that Osai did not repeat when he filed his mission report because it was not his to report, because it was the first thing said between the two parties in 7 years, and it belonged to them. The other party's lead representative responded. Osai left the room. He sat in the corridor outside and looked at his hands and thought about 4 days in a structure on the second planet of Vethar 7 and 14 days in a conflict zone, and 19 years of diplomatic service, and the specific quality of things that were worth the wrong name. 2 hours later, the lead representatives came out of the room. They said, we need a framework. He said, I know, I have one prepared. He had it prepared for 6 weeks. He handed it to them. They took it. He went home. 3 weeks later, the ceasefire was formally declared. The Conclave's Security Council received the declaration with the quality of an institution that had been watching a trajectory and had seen the trajectory change and was processing what the change meant. Nalan called Osai. She said, the ceasefire is holding. He said, yes. She said, the theoretical division has completed its preliminary review of the documentation. They are revising their position. He said, all 200 years of it. She said, yes, they are not happy about it. He said, they will be. She was quiet for a moment. She said, the patrol vessel, the one that said safe passage. He said, yes. She said, you described the exchange to both parties on the third call. He said, yes. She said that was the call that produced the yes. He said the patrol vessel understood the calculation. It was paying the cost directly. When I described what I had found in the terms of the calculation, it recognized what I was describing because it was living the calculation in a way the decision makers were not. When I told the decision makers that the people paying the cost had said safe passage to someone trying to end it, I was telling them that the people paying it already knew the calculation was wrong. The decision makers were the last ones still protecting themselves from knowing it. She said, the silence is not a weapon. He said, no. She said, it is a proof. He said, it is proof that the calculation is wrong. The weapon was never the point. The point was never to force an end. The point was to make both parties know the same true thing at the same time. When both parties know the same true thing, the calculation changes, and when the calculation changes, the moments accumulate into something that holds. Nalan looked out the viewport of her office. She said, the Class 7 designation. You knew what it meant. He said, yes. She said, you went anyway. He said, the proof was in Vethar 7, and the trajectory was 900 million, and the proof was worth finding. She said, you came back. He said, the geometry was right. She was quiet for a moment. He said, Senior Arbiter, the 3 occasions the silence was applied in Rithkai history, the historical record says they held. The conflicts did not resume. She said, yes. He said, the mechanism once demonstrated changes what both parties know. Once you know the calculation is wrong, you cannot unknow it. The knowing accumulates. She said, you think this one will hold? He said, I think the patrol vessel that said safe passage to someone trying to end the conflict it was fighting and understood something that the decision makers are just now learning. I think understanding accumulates in populations faster than it accumulates in institutions. I think the ceasefire will hold because the people paying the cost already knew the calculation was wrong, and the people making the decisions have now seen the proof and cannot unknow it. She said, and if you are wrong? He said, then I will have been wrong and the record will show what was attempted and what it cost. She said, you are not wrong. He said, I know. She said, how do you know? He said, because the patrol vessel said safe passage. She looked out the viewport. She said, Ambassador Osai, the Archive Division wants to name the documentation you retrieved. The Rithkai silence was the Rithkai's name for the principal. The Archive Division wants to know if there is a name for the proof, for what you found in the structure. He thought about 4 days in a building that 400 years of knowledge had built to be understood. About the Rithkai's last members choosing Vethar 7 because of what the system contained that made it right. About the structure and the mechanism and the proof encoded in the spatial relationships of a building that had been waiting 200 years for someone to walk through it. He said, the Rithkai built it to be found when someone was ready to find it, when the trajectory was bad enough and the need was real enough and someone went through the conflict zone to reach it. They built the threshold into the finding. You had to go through the hard thing to get there. She said, so what do we call what you found? He said, call it what it is, call it the proof. The rest is in the mechanism, the rest is in the walking through it. She said, and the walking through, what does it produce? He was quiet for a moment. He thought about 2 parties in a room after 4 hours of seeing the same thing at the same moment. About the first thing said between them in 7 years that he had not reported because it belonged to them. About the calculation and what changed when you could not unknow a true thing. He said, it produces the moment after the calculation changes. The moment when both parties know the cost of stopping is less than the cost of continuing, and they know the other party knows it too, and the knowing of the knowing is the thing that makes the moment safe. She said, and then? He said, and then the moments accumulate. She said, into what? He looked at his hands. He said, into something that holds.